infrastructure sector. Now, infrastructure is a crucial enabler for growth. Creating new and upgrading existing infrastructure is the key to increasing India's competitiveness and achieving the target of $5 trillion economy by 2025. Rapid changes in demography generates a compelling demand for development of a host of infrastructure facilities such as housing, water, sanitation, digital and transportation services. Now, the government has so far taken a number of steps to improve infrastructure and boost the growth in this sector. A recent report by the Task Force for National Infrastructure Pipeline has also outlined the plans to invest a substantial sum of approximately 102 lakh crore rupees in various infrastructure projects in the next 5 years. So what are the expectations of the infrastructure sector from Budget 2020 and what can the Finance Minister do to meet those expectations? For more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of guests in the studio. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Mr. M. Ramachandran, former Secretary, Ministry of Urban Development, Government of India. We also have with us Mr. Shubhmoy Bhattacharjee, Consulting Editor of the Business Standard, and we're also joined by Mr. Sanjay Agarwal, Senior Vice President, PhD Chambers of Commerce, the industry representative. Let me begin with you, Shubhmoy, and let's try and understand as to what has the infrastructure sector gone through in this particular fiscal, and what is it that you see in terms of infrastructure sector's needs?
Well, what it has gone through is, of course, a slowdown. That's, of course, doesn't bear repetition. What it needs is obviously to come out of the slowdown, to put it on just simply on that lines. What it has not been happening is that infrastructure sector is one of those which has the longest lead time for any economy. So you put in money for infrastructure investment, a road, a plant, a bridge, anything, and the returns on it take at least 4 to 5 years at the minimum. It could often take even longer. That makes it a particularly tricky sector to invest in because it needs long-term money, it needs a lot of money, and the returns on it require a very strong and stable policy environment.
Okay.
For a developing economy, these are challenges, especially, and for a continental size economy like India, it also means own particular challenges that come from availability of land, availability of easy capital, availability of the tax environment which has been set out. Now, what's happened in India is that, to put something in numbers, we have an expectation by 2022. We expect something. I mean, we would need something like $780 billion of US dollar investment in the country. How much have we got from between January to say September? About say $40 billion. So you can see the difference. There's massive gap available there. Now, it doesn't mean that means it's not performing. It simply means that whatever you can give it in, it can soak it and ask for more. Practically every sector in India needs infrastructure investment, and in fact even the sectors which were traditionally not considered infra, the soft infra that we call, education and health, even those sectors need massive investments. To take a case in point, we are now talking about the challenge of the coronavirus that's spreading. It would mean a very strong, robust response from the health sector in India. To be able to do that, the health sector needs even more investment in its infrastructure, in terms of not just doctors and nurses, but also in terms of the equipment available, the facilities available. So you can see infrastructure is something that is very critical, as you pointed out right at the beginning, for an economy to ensure that it keeps on running. Let's look at the sector like energy. The energy sector in oil and gas, even now, I mean, we are talking of phasing out, but we are now at a stretch where we are, for instance, talking about setting up gas supply, city gas supply to about 100 cities in India. That's what the Prime Minister has announced, and tenders have been given out. It means building up an infrastructure of pipelines across the country and then within the cities. These are mammoth tasks. So it would need a fair amount. So these are challenges, these are opportunities, and to make those opportunities work, what one needs is, therefore, as I said right at the beginning, availability of easy capital, availability of land. Obviously, infrastructure is very strongly connected to the availability of land, and the availability of a standard, stable policy environment, which makes it possible for an investor to say that I will invest and the policy will not change for the next 5, 8, 10 years.
Okay, so the complex demands as far as the infrastructure sector is concerned at all levels, and if you look at simply what you're pointing out, Shubhmoy, is that investment is the key out there. But let me bring in Mr. Ramachandran here. Mr. Ramachandran, with urbanization rapidly setting in, it is almost, but it continues to. That would mean further that there'll be demand for more investment, more money to be spent on several aspects of infrastructure, the transport, the water, the sanitation, housing and all that. So that also is a big challenge for the policy makers and the governments to go ahead and tackle out there.
Absolutely, you are 100% right on that, and as Sukumoy mentioned, there is no dearth of opportunity or areas within the urban sector also where a whole lot of investment needs to be made. Now, if you look at some of the missions which we already have, the Smart Cities mission and Amrit particularly, these two, the key programs. Amrit seems to have taken off very well, and it's doing well. One doesn't know what will happen beyond the 5-year period which was announced up to 2020. Hopefully, probably Amrit will have another existence in some other form, maybe linked to the Jal Jeevan mission or so. So that the Amrit program stretches out to all the close to 500 small cities and towns. And of course, the Smart Cities mission, probably people would say that it took time to take off. But beyond this also, as you mentioned, there are various other areas. Mobility is a critical issue as far as our cities and towns are concerned. And that's something which calls for answer. And as I repeat this point, when people were asked to contribute to the smart city preparation process, more than water in many places, it is mobility which took priority. That shows the desire of the people that I should be able to move about faster as far as city is concerned, and that leads to saving in time. There are economic prospects also related to that. So these are all areas where a whole lot of work still needs to be done. It's a question of how that could get triggered and how that could happen. When we look at metros, we still haven't reached all the cities with 1 million plus population. So there is again so much to be done.
But it's a rapid progress as far as that.
There is a steady progress, but one always desires that it could be even faster if possible. Of course, that gets linked to the availability of resources and how can that be done. And this urban is a little difficult and challenging area because the center provides for certain schemes and funding, but it's for the states and the local bodies to act further. So there are 3 links in the chain, so to say. So ultimately the final link at the city end has to be much more proactive, and also they have to look in terms of, as is assumed under the Smart Cities mission and Amrit, they should be able to generate more resources going beyond the budgetary provisions, and that is what is critical as far as our cities are concerned.
Okay, let me bring in the industry perspective here as well. Mr. Agarwal is here with us from PhD Chambers of Commerce. Mr. Agarwal, from the industry's point of view, and specifically looking at the infrastructure sector, what is it that the industry wants as far as this particular budget is concerned? That's one aspect. And what is it that is the problem area as far as the infrastructure? Shubhmoy has pointed out some, Mr. Ramachandran has pointed out some, but in addition to that, what is it that you guys believe?
You see, what Sukumoy and Mr. Ramachandran pointed out, there are many issues, but at the same time, I would like to begin by really applauding the sort of progress that the country has been making and the sort of plans that we are having. 80 lakh crores, I am told, was spent over the last 11-12 years on infrastructure, and now we are going to more than double the speed with which we will invest, in the sense that we will spend 100 lakh crores in 5 years. That by itself is something that every Indian should be very happy about, because yes, we are spending heavily into infrastructure, we are building the infrastructure, but yes, there are problems. Some things I would say are to be taken up on a more long-term basis rather than just as a budget perspective. Although coming to the long-term perspective first, and then maybe I'll mention about the budget also. On the long-term side, you see, as Sukumoy also mentioned, the so-called soft infrastructure or social infrastructure, which is also mentioned, by the way, in the NIP document also, the task force which...
The National Infrastructure Pipeline.
National Infrastructure Pipeline document. You see, we are very badly lacking on the social front in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of skilling, also in terms of law and order and delivery of justice, in the sense in terms of lack of judicial strength that we need. Now, I was looking at the numbers. I think for judiciary our country spends 0.08% of the GDP, which is I don't know where it takes us when we take so much flack as a country. When we talk of infrastructure, as Sukhmoy also mentioned, as Mr. Ramachandran also would agree, every investor needs a stable regime and enforceability of contract.
Okay.
Now, if we are so miserly in our spending on our judiciary, on our legal systems, and the contracts do not become enforceable, and it takes 10, 20 years for any single dispute to be sorted out, I think this is a huge roadblock in the way of building infrastructure. Because for building infrastructure, you need investment, you need investors, and investors need certainty of enforceability of contracts.
Okay. Dispute resolution mechanism.
Dispute resolution mechanism means that you have to spend on it. You see, point is, we have a shortage of courts, we have a shortage of judges. We have the number of sanctioned judges is very low. On top of that, even within those less sanctioned posts, there is a substantial shortage. I am told that more than 5,000 judicial vacancies are there out of 2,000 judicial posts, 20,000 posts.
Okay.
This malady goes up to the high courts. So this has to be sorted out. Policing. Considering the world standards, I think we have just 1.2 policemen per 1,000 people. I think we need to at least double it. You will be spending money in the economy, you will be spreading money in the economy, there will be money, people will have money to spend, but at the same time you will be ensuring law and order in the country, which is not happening. You need to build police stations, you need to build more courtrooms, you need to build maybe even some more prisons.
So social infrastructure you're focusing on.
But no, it's not it's one very important part, I would say, because the big money has to go on roads, railways, power, all those big money is there. But the comparatively smaller amount of money, the lower hanging fruit, which we should be spending on, historically we were always saying that we do not have the money. Now when we have this huge cache of money which we are going to spend on our infrastructure, let us understand that there are low hanging fruit which are to be garnered from education, health, policing, judiciary.
Okay. And how do you look at that budget perspective specifically? Because all of us here understand, and all the experts are also pointing out that just like manufacturing services, infrastructure is also a very crucial sector for the growth, the GDP to grow further. And if we are to achieve that target of $5 trillion economy by 2025, which is being set, then the infrastructure sector will have to be given a big push, a big boost. So what specifically from this particular budget you believe can be done?
You see, as a chamber, we do not believe in freebies and we don't believe in asking for this break or that break. I think we have to look at something more sustainable and solid. What really is required is that the money should flow in. As Sukhmoy said, we need stability in the tax regime, in the legal regime. We as long as an investor is sure that this is what he is bargained for, this is what he is going to get, let us ensure that. Let us not have retrospective changes in law or sudden shocks to the investors. Let us have stability. And what we would expect from the budget is to make sure that adequate money is available for the NIP, for the National Infrastructure Plan that we want to spend. Let us make sure that the budget is able to provide that money.
Okay. Shubhmoy, two aspects here from what Mr. Agrawal has pointed out. One is when he is saying that there has to be a simultaneous focus on big infrastructure projects as well as the social sector infrastructure, something which you're talking about, education, health. He has added, the legal mechanism or the police services. Second is the national infrastructure pipeline. That figure, a huge, humongous figure, 102 lakh crore rupees of projects.
Absolutely huge one. And you'd notice that only 22% of that is expected to come from the private sector. So which means that essentially the government isn't expecting more than that, even at the best about 25% or so, to come from the private sector, which means almost the entire part of the private investment portfolio will have to be built by the government. And if it has to be built by the government, what does it mean? It means that essentially the government will have to find the resources to be able to build it probably on something like an EPC mode, engineering, procurement, construction, rather than a PPP. A PPP will actually qualify as a private sector, private public sector partnership. So you go in for that, and then sort of sell out. So there's an interesting part to this entire infrastructure building mechanism. See, infrastructure, as Mr. Agarwal is pointing out, one is the dispute resolution should be smooth. Simultaneously, when infrastructure is being built, it's a continuous process, then it has to be also be sold. Assets have to be monetized. So the government has to also ensure, we have just started on this process. This year we had planned about 1 lakh crore rupees of asset monetization. Next year it should be higher. The government should continuously sell assets, and it's actually a good idea, because when you sell assets, what happens is it creates resources, and those resources can go into creating the social infrastructure, where it's only the government which will provide it. So what you do is, the trick is that you build projects, build the bridges, airports, railway projects, and so on and so forth, and then keep on selling them as soon as they are completed.
Okay.
So that the private sector, which is better in terms of running those projects, which is definitely they take it up, and the government keeps on getting the monetization of the assets back, and that money then gets to be used for building other infrastructure. So it's a chain that has to be done, and frankly speaking, we in India haven't done too much of this.
Okay.
It's been piecemeal. Some of it has been done. In fact, this government has been, they should be given credit for the TOT projects, bundling of several road projects, bringing them together and selling it. The first one was the bundling was sold to Macquarie Group. The second one was sold to, I forget the name, but the good initiatives. Now that needs to become regular, that there are projects being built and then being sold out.
The BOT.
Yeah, and if they're to be sold out, any it doesn't really matter which format it is, but the point is that once they're completed, they should be sold out. And once they're sold out, then obviously you need to ensure that the terms of the policy, terms of contract stay the same. You can't keep around, changing the terms, because then obviously the bidders will get nervous about taking those projects.
Okay, Mr. Agarwal, that sounds like a good idea out there.
I totally agree. You see, we have to generate the resources to spend. Now, the disinvestment process is by itself, by definition, a complicated process. There are so many pushes and pulls involved. One additional suggestion that the PhD chamber has been very strongly giving to the government is to focus more and more on REIT and InvITs models for real estate and InvITs for the other infrastructure. The advantage being that in the InvIT model, where you might be monetizing assets like telecom towers or maybe power transmission lines and all, the investor gets to have a secured income plus the chances of an upside, whereas the promoter or the proposer, in which case when a PSU is doing that, it would still practically remain, at least the management side initially would remain in the hands of the PSU, and later on that divestment could be an easier divestment in the sense that the size of or the value of the asset then that is to be given control of would become lower.
Okay.
So all such innovative models have to be tried in tandem to see where all the money can be raised.
Okay, Mr. Ramchandran, your views on these two aspects. One, the divestment model, which PhD Chambers has suggested, which Mr. Agarwal is talking about, and the other, which Shubhmoy is talking about, in terms of large infrastructure projects. Government builds, the private sector operates.
I think the highway sector has taken a very good initiative in the sector, as Shubhmoy was mentioning, the TOT part of it, and that's the way to go about.
Can be done with other infrastructure projects.
Yeah, one should actively think in those terms. Monetization of assets, that has become important, because it's becoming very clear it's just not possible to depend only on what comes out of the budget. So one has to go beyond that. So in the case of cities, again, we have been talking about municipal bonds for quite a number of months and years. It has not really become practical and possible. Similarly, corporate bonds. So these are all the other methods of raising resources. Disinvestment, if it can work better, if it can still meet the target for the current year, nothing like it. So one has to look at all these possibilities. Why I highlight this is 74% of our revenues which are generated go as revenue expenditure. So the kitty with which one can play is much limited as far as all the infrastructure projects are concerned. So the the initiative taken by the highway sector, I think that's worth looking into, and they're going to expand it further. We should think of other sectors where this is possible. We have to think of newer methods of doing this, and people have to be brought into the scheme of things. Housing is another area where there has been a little bit of a slump. I suppose it can pick up further, and it's possible if some of the issues are sorted out, it is possible to take this forward. Its contribution has come down to GDP, it has come down. So it should be possible. RERA has been a stabilizer in one sense, but it's a question of where is the liquidity. So we have to look at these new methods or additional methods of finding the resources so that the required quantum of investment required becomes available for the infrastructure sector.
Okay, so eventually it comes down to where is the money, and that is the big question which all the policies and all the solutions should be trying to find an answer to. Let's now have one quick question to all three of you before we bring this to an end, and I'm not going to ask you to hazard a guess, but what is it that you, all three of you, might expect in terms of what we might see in the budget for infrastructure sector? Let's begin with you, Shubhmoy.
Well, I would say, one is that there should be more transparency in numbers. Once that happens, then the government's size of the problem and the challenges ahead and also the solutions become easier. So that would be very useful.
Okay.
If that comes true, then that will actually make life a lot easier.
Okay. Mr. Agrawal?
To my view, this budget should be growth oriented, and one should not be overly concerned about the fiscal deficit. I think what the economy reads right now is money being injected into the business, into the overall monetary system, and it's very important that the money is made freely available, and that if there is too much of a stress on fiscal deficits and looking at that, I think that should not be the case. We rather hope that the government should be looking at some good injection of liquidity and economy, money into the economy.
Okay, more liquidity and more investment there. Concluding words from you, Mr. Ramchandran.
Lending has to pick up, which is critical for the economy now. As usual with all the others, I would also think that probably there is some scope about personal income tax, corporate tax has already happened. But more than that, I suppose some of the programs which the government has initiated, I suppose the allocation also would be a little bit more so that more of the activity can happen. As I mentioned, for the medium level cities, there is much more which can be done. Also, with some more provision, I think those cities, I look at the total of 4,000 plus cities and towns, we are talking about 500 plus which are in the 1 lakh plus category. So if we can substantially address the issues, including water becoming available to everyone at the as one opens a tap and things like that. Swachh Bharat has done substantial work. Housing, there is work happening, but it has to reach a certain target which is set. So some of these basic fundamentals, if they become available, I think city living becomes much more easier. For that, whatever the budget can do within the limitations, I suppose that will be a very positive measure.
Okay, so there it is. Thank you so much, Mr. Ramchandran, Shubhmoy and Mr. Agrawal out there for your views. Clearly, that's what our experts are pointing out as far as infrastructure sector is concerned. More liquidity, more investment and more fund allocation, not only in the budget, but maybe some tweak in the policies of the government as well. And the programs which are already running, they also need to be